Thank you guys so much for being here today or being wherever you are. Like she said, my name is Beth. I work with our housing navigation program here at Presentation Partners in Housing. And I have a little bit of history in here a little later in the presentation to kind of talk a little bit more about housing navigation. But I really wanted to just really stay true to what we were talking about today, which is housing first and the principles. Um, do, do, do. So today we're going to cover some of the foundational elements of housing first as a philosophy versus housing first as an intervention, and kind of all the different core components that come with that. And so when we're first talking about housing first, I think we need to start by talking about homelessness, right? Because housing first is a direct response to this homeless crisis that we really started to see here in the United States. Homelessness has had a history of different time periods that it has been prevalent in the United States, but we really started seeing it again in the 70s with a lot of like the policy and administration choices that were being made around that time, and a lot of the just oppression and racism that our community or that our country seeing. So when we're starting to talk about homelessness, I'd like to talk about our history of how we've initially tried to address homelessness. So back in like the late 70s, early 80s, we had what was called kind of like a step-based model to address the rising issue of homelessness at that time. And it really kind of parallels that linear residential treatment model. So the starting point is that treating homelessness almost like it was a disease, like it's something that is just wrong with that person. That's why they're homeless. And they need to go through a series of steps in order to get housing. And so those steps usually looked like outreaching that person, getting them into shelter. If they do well enough in shelter, we'll get them into transitional housing. Transitional housing back then lasted 6 months to 2 years. Once they've really shown us that they have the skills to be housed, then they can move into permanent housing and graduate. They're done. Some of the problems with this model was that it didn't work. That's kind of the biggest problem. Homelessness just kept growing and growing. People were falling out of housing, and it keeps people homeless the longest period of time, and therefore costs our communities the most money. So we call this kind of the housing ready model. And again, it starts with like that person needs to be fixed. There's a lot of like programming that we do while they're homeless. We support them a lot while they're homeless and then kind of withdraw those supports as they get housed. And when they no longer need supports, then they can be housed. Usually these programs are high demand. So, for example, if a person's staying in shelter and was drinking, they would be kicked out, and that was just kind of the end of it historically. And participants just lose their housing if they can't meet those expectations. So, I I have been working in the homeless services field since 2010. And one of the foundational experiences I had was I wanted to share the story of this is Alonzo. So I was working at the Dorothy Day House in Moorhead around, I think, 2011 when we first met Alonzo. And I was working the evening shift, and someone from New Life called and they were like, Beth, we have this guy. He seems like he's really, really having a mental health something. He can't even talk. He's not doing well here. Could you take him at Dorothy Day? And we had an opening. So we were like, yeah. So we got to meet Alonzo. And, he was so just having such a health struggle that he couldn't even speak, and was just really really struggling. So we of course were like, okay, well, what do we do? Well, we started by like helping him address his mental health, helping him feel safe in the shelter, worked on just getting a lot of like supports in place, connected him with Path for mental health case management, connected him with homeless health for all these things. And so we did a lot of like the good things that you're supposed to do, right, as a case manager, to connect him, to really get him into those places. And then once we kind of had those wellness issues more under control, he was speaking, he was talking about what's important to him. We were having good conversations. He was able to kind of modify any of the issues that he had enough so that he could stay in the shelter. So he wasn't drinking. He was doing really good. One of the first things he talked about wanting to do was to touch base with his 17-year-old twin daughters in Arizona. That's where he had come from. He came out to North Dakota for the oil boom back in the day. And so he asked me to help. I'll never forget. He asked me to help him. How do I explain to my daughters that I'm in a homeless shelter? It's like, I don't know. How do you want to? How can I help you? So we just kind of explained that, he was homeless right now, but he's working really hard on recovering and he wouldn't be homeless, forever eventually. And they were just, happy to hear from their dad, but obviously they were worried. And I just remember walking away from that phone call as we hung up the shelter phone, him just saying, I don't like that they think of me as homeless. And I remember being like, but you're so much more than homeless. So let's work on getting you housed, right? So we worked on all the things, did all the great case planning, got supported employment in place, got all these things. This is him in his supported employment job. He was able to kind of recover. We found all this random funding to get his tools shipped back from Arizona so he could work at this auto shop. He's doing really amazing. Oh, and uh, sorry. My extremely persistent uncle has decided to come over and bring a couch, so there could be some banging. I apologize. So anyway, we got all these things in place, and then we felt like, okay, he has income, he has all the things, he has supports. Let's do housing. So we found a place. It was over in Fargo. He moved into it. We set him up with stuff. Thought he was good. Said goodbye. And that's kind of where every single thing fell through. Part of it was switching from Minnesota to North Dakota. He lost all his benefits, he lost all of his health care, he lost everything. We couldn't get him reconnected. And, he just like slowly started to deteriorate. And he kept, asking for help. And we were trying to provide help. But, when you move someone out of the shelter, you have someone new in the shelter. So we were doing our best, and it just wasn't our model to support people when they moved into housing. And then ultimately, he ended up taking his own life. And I then will never forget the formative experience it was for me of reconnecting with his 17-year-old daughters and having to tell them that. And so obviously we can never say like, oh, well, this person completed suicide because of this, this, and this. But before I worked at the shelter, I worked at the Merit Care Hospital for many, many years on the cancer floor. And I remember when we talked to families, we'd always, talk about how we'd done everything we could to help them. Um, and while I felt like we had done everything we could to help him, it wasn't the right things, or it was the right things, but it wasn't in the right place or at the right time. And so that's when I really kind of tried to take that experience with Alonzo and move forward and figure out, how can we do better? Because it really made sense at the time, but it didn't have a good outcome. So try something different. So really trying like as a system, how can we start with evidence? Because what we have from the past, and this is still very prevalent in a lot of our approach to homelessness today, is how do we treat homelessness? How do we fix homelessness? Well, how about we start by looking at evidence? And when we're talking about evidence, we're talking about there's proven facts that have made an intervention approach or belief true. Opinion is kind of our subjective conclusion. And sometimes in services, we have some cognitive dissonance, such as like back when we were like, well, this person just needs to be good and fixed and not mentally ill, and then they can be housed, right? But that's not evidence based, and let me tell you why. So here's some truths about homelessness. About 34 million Americans in the United States are living in poverty. 51.5 million are living with mental illness. 13 million are living with severe mental illness. almost 20 million are living with a substance use disorder, and yet only 3.5 million Americans will experience homelessness each year. And by only, that's a terrible way to put it, but there's 3.5 million Americans who are experiencing homelessness any given year. About 500,000 are experiencing homelessness on any given night. And then about a fifth of that, 110,000, are chronically of our neighbors are chronically homeless. So even if we just start here with, some of our data and some of our math, this I think goes to show that of all these people experiencing homelessness, not all of them have mental health issues. Not all of them have these issues. Many of them do. But look at that percentage. There are so many who manage to never experience homelessness, even with these pieces. And so, really shifting this idea about homelessness from this disease based model to more of a social justice model. What social injustice is occurring that's pulling these people into homelessness? So, some more truths about homelessness. So, Dennis Culhane is a really um, not famous, is a good researcher, I don't know, in homelessness. And he identified through his research about three types of people who are homeless or households who are homeless. So, about 80% of people experiencing homelessness are transitionally homeless. This means that they're homeless usually one time in their life for less than 2 weeks, and they figure it out typically without having to ask anybody like us for help. So, they're typically like invisible. We don't really see them, they're under the radar. Um, More typologies of homelessness. So, about 10% are episodically homeless. These people tend to cycle in and out of homelessness. And then the other 10% are considered. So these people are homeless for over a year, sometimes much longer, have a disabling condition, and are oftentimes the people that we see. Their homelessness is a lot more visible. It's a lot less hidden, because you can see all the things that are on their back. You can see them literally sleeping outside in doorways. And so, if we're talking about like our system and responding to homelessness, we really kind of want to ground ourselves in this idea about equality versus equity. Equality, everybody kind of being treated like getting the exact same thing, versus equity, having, fairness across all situations. And so when we look at the typologies of homelessness, there's going to be different interventions for different types of homelessness. And Housing First is the most evidence-based and researched for chronically homeless and transitionally homeless. So Housing First is a philosophy. So Housing First, just in its core, is this deep intrinsic belief that people deserve housing, that it is an emergency for people to be sleeping outside, for kids to be sleeping in a car. This is an emergency, and it's a medical emergency. People are dying. And I think like our society has just gotten really like used to it. But so Housing First is reconnecting us to this belief that housing is a basic human right. And people, especially people who've been chronically homeless, deserve supported housing to um, break out of homelessness and maintain their housing with no preconceived expectations that, like, for example, people are compliant, people are sober, people are employed or with income, have graduated transitional programs, or even nice. Like, that was a startling fact for me when I first started working in shelter in 2010. It's like, oh, some people are not nice. And then I think I quickly learned, like, well, you wouldn't be nice either, man, if you. I try to think about like when I get hangry, like not nice. And I have a house and I took a shower this morning and I have had the privilege to have all my basic needs met and function at that higher level and not be actively traumatized right now. So that's why I'm nice. Not that a lot of our people aren't nice, but you know what I mean? Like, you don't have to be nice. I wouldn't be nice if I were being actively oppressed either. So then enter in our Housing First model. our starting point is really like you deserve housing. We want a really simple, low barrier application process to get these people connected to housing. And then once they're in housing, providing all of those services to promote housing stability and well being. And the housing is permanent. It can't be a housing first model if it's like, if you do well enough here for 3 months, then you can move somewhere else. Like, it's not, that's not a thing. Doesn't mean they have to be on a year-long lease. We have lots of people lease up on like a 3-month lease or a month-to-month lease because they have been living outside and it's terrifying to be in a building and they're not sure if this is going to work out. So then they have more flexibility, right? Or sometimes landlords see like a really long criminal history and want the flexibility for month to month. And so then the participant and the landlord make that choice together. But so services can be short term or long term, depending on the participant's need. Again, housing isn't dependent on them going to treatment or, following every aspect of their case plan and doing those pieces. They can keep their housing if they choose not to do those pieces. But honestly, like housing is seen as a right, not a reward for good behavior. When you're using Housing First as an intervention, um, there are research-based models. Currently, there's these three: critical time intervention, intensive case management, and assertive community treatment that have all been researched and proven fidelity to the Housing First intervention. I guess I don't remember why I highlighted ICM. Oh, because my program is ICM. Um, and Housing First is used across all of these different types of um, interventions and services. So to kind of like fast forward us from 2011 with Alonzo to 2015 with Bart, I'd like you to meet Bart. I was still working at the Dorothy Day House. We had a gentleman, Bart, come in. He was about 55 years old. He'd been homeless since he was 19. So, using Housing First as a system, we immediately assessed him for housing, found out that with his health conditions and stuff, he was one of the most vulnerable people in our community. So we got him connected to a housing voucher right away. We were working on finding housing. And he had some like tough behaviors. He had really complex trauma, PTSD. Um, Shelter life was really overstimulating. It was hard. He was one of those people that you might describe as not nice. But like again, just tried to work with him, get him into housing because like shelter is not the goal. Um, One of the day that we had an apartment showing, he that afternoon had finally gone into the doctor to address some of the health issues he'd been facing, and they did some tests and found out that he had liver cancer. So he immediately kind of like left the shelter, went back to the street, said like, screw this, I don't want to do this. So so at this point is when we really tried to like break the model, break the model of people being in having to be in our shelter to work with them because we were so close to housing. So we went and we outreached him under the bridge, talked about like, do you really not want housing? Because we have it almost ready to go. And he was like, well, I do. I just got overwhelmed and whatnot. So we were working with him, got him approved for this apartment. I think a couple days before he was like the apartment was moving ready, he ended up going into the hospital because he had just deteriorated so quickly. Um, and then at that point, he was admitted and they said that, he maybe had like 3 weeks to live. It was just a very rapid onset and he had gone without, like so many homeless people, he'd gone without health care for most of his entire life. So the hospital was even worse than the shelter for triggering his PTSD and complex trauma. We tried to get the apartment. See, he was like, I mean, I do still want to be housed. So we tried to push the apartment forward and we were getting it. But then his condition, like I said, had deteriorated so much he had to move home on hospice. And you can't work with hospice if you live alone and don't have supports in your building. So He was like, please, please move me back under the bridge. I don't want to die in a hospital. My parents died in the hospital. I would rather die under the bridge than in this hospital. And we were like, hell no. Like, this is not okay. Like, this is where we have to like stop these systems. So we came together as a community. Like, literally, I think I worked with like 20 different agencies to figure out how to make housing for this person. And we did. We started we got into the medical respite program for Fargo Housing before they were even ready, but they understood. So we got him into an apartment, got him all of the services. I remember the night before he moved in, I was leaving the hospital and the doctor, because I had worked on this floor just serendipitously for like 10 years before this. And they had said, Beth, we thought 3 weeks when he was admitted. Now it's looking like 3 days. He's just doing so poorly. And so I remember just like hoping that he would make it through the night. I didn't want him to die in a hospital. The next day he made it. We got him moved over to the apartment. Me and a lot of the staff like helped him get it all set up. He was so tired. We left at the end of the day, and I kind of like had to make my own peace with the fact that the next day when we came back, he might have passed away. So the next day, came back, knocked on the door. He hollered for us to come in. I looked at the bed. He wasn't in the bed. I was like, he fell down. Oh no. But he wasn't on the floor. And then I like came around the corner and he was standing in front of the fridge, putting away some beer with his wheelchair kind of pushed behind him. And he had a bright purple, shiny lanyard with his keys on it. And I was like, hey, man. He's like, hey, did you know there's a dollar store and a liquor store like a block away from here? I was like, I did. How did you know that? He's like, I went for a stroll. And we were like, oh my gosh, okay, cool. So it was really, really amazing to see this immediate healing effect that housing had on this incredible man who had spent most of his life outdoors. And so then we just actually we got to get to work, and I had said, what would be helpful? Like, how can we help you? Um, and he's like, what do we do now? I was like, I don't know. What do you want to do? And he's like, well, I have this home health aide coming in. Would it be weird if I have her cut up my vegetables and fruit I just got at the grocery store that is also across the street? And I was like, no, why would that be weird? And he was like, well, is it weird that I want to eat healthy now that I'm dying? Is it weird to take care of myself now? And I was like, no, that's not weird at all. And I wrote it down here. He said, Beth, you just feel differently about yourself when you have a home. You feel better, like you're worth something. And I want to take care of myself now. And he did. He spent the next, like I said, they thought he had maybe 3 days to live right before he moved into housing. And he lived 28 days. And during those 28 days, he just voiced so much more happiness and content. And he reconnected with his family. And we were chatting maybe a week or so before he died. And he said, Beth, did you know that I had a twin brother? I said, no, you've never told me that. And he said, yeah, he died when I was 19 years old. And in my head, I was just like, okay, so there's the connection there. And he's like, and I'm just happy that I have a place now. I know it's really late in my life, but I'm happy I have a place. I connected with my family and I can die in peace now. And so I was like, this is what we need to do. This is what we need to do. Because my takeaway from this was my real understanding is that we need to house people like their lives depend on it, because their lives do depend on it. And really, ever since that day, I look at every single person that I work with, every single person our program works with, and every single person our system works with. And when somebody tells me someone's not ready for housing, I say to them, are they ready to die on the street? Because I believe no one's ready to die on the street or under the bridge. So how do we do that as a system? So kind of our program orientation, like we just said, recognizing that clients are ready for housing. But the big key piece that I'll talk about a little more later is that we need to have the supports in housing, especially for people with a history of homelessness and who are chronically homeless. There, need to be some supports in place. And so how do we reorient our system is something that we've been working on for the last 10 years to have less services that are around, you know, programming when they're homeless and more about programming when they're housed. And so utilizing progressive and assertive engagement techniques so that we're delivering the right resources to the right people at the right point in time for the right amount of time. Because again, like with Alonzo, I feel like it was a lot of the right services to the right person, but it wasn't in the right place. It wasn't in a place where he could actually heal. So some program and system indicators of Housing First are looking at, are participants accepted into programs whether or not they're sober? Do they have to have income? We have assessments and case planning. Are they really centered around housing and housing as quickly as possible? Can participants refuse services and stay in their housing? Can we serve those with the highest barriers and the most intensive service needs? Because they're the most likely to die on the street first. And ultimately, if participants lose their housing, do we rehouse them without judgment or punitive measures? These are good like system indicators for Housing First. We also have, I'm not going to go into it super duper in depth, but some people don't know that, I've met that have even worked, and said that they're doing Housing First for years, don't know that there are kind of a few different models around Housing First. The most research based is the Pathways Housing First model. And so if you've read any of their workbooks, they always say it's PHF, Pathways Housing First, because a lot of it really originated with them. And there have been different like variations across, but you can find this on Google, just Googling Pathways Housing First Fidelity Scale. And it does a really nice job of breaking down different domains of Housing First. And kind of you can do a self-assessment, or we've done with other programs where we assess their programs, they assessed ours. When I met with Samson Barris, who is considered like the father of Housing First, he works for, he started Pathways Housing First. When we met with him in 2016, and I met with him again last year and talked about Housing First, I remember I was like, okay, but like, so for example, what about with this person? How would we rate ourselves on this Likert scale of 1 to 4? Because, he didn't get housing for like 3 months, but we offered him a lot of places and he didn't like them. And he was like, okay, that's okay. So then like you get a lower score in like how quickly you house someone, but you get a higher score in the choices that you offered them. And he's like, and ultimately we just see over and over again, the more choice people have in their housing, the better that they do. So it's a really, really helpful thing. We just kind of do it in our program a few times a year and educate ourselves around it. So again, it's like 13 pages. This is just a quick little sample, but can be good. Um, and so then I wanted to kind of use this piece to talk about the 5 interdependent principles of Housing First. Um, oh yeah, this is the part where we find out if my video works. Scary. So the first principle is immediate access to housing with no housing readiness conditions. So we have the person experiencing homelessness, some quality housing, and a team and a system that believes in them. Here's a short video. So the Rain City Housing worked with Pathways. I don't know if you guys have seen the videos, but there's a series of 5 videos. Each one talks about each of these principles. I literally watch them every year because they're really helpful, I feel. So I can see you, Kelly. Will you tell me if this sound
Okay.
works?
So for
Bad.
oh, yep,
Oh, it is working.
maybe, no. It's not working.
Okay, so the spoiler of it all is that they talk about that we can't not house people for the very reason that they need housing and expect homelessness to end. So if you want 10-minute little snippets to, present at your staff meetings. Like we do that, especially when we've had new case managers. One staff meeting, we talk about this principle and we play the video and then we have discussion. They're all available on YouTube, Rain City Housing. Really, really good, great content. So I think we've already kind of talked in depth about that immediate access to housing with no housing readiness conditions. Um, the second kind of principle is this idea of consumer choice and self-determination.
Hey, Beth.
Yeah,
Allison just commented, she's an IT expert.
love that.
She said when you share your screen, you'll click include computer sound and it should work. So maybe you want to go back and try.
I will be vulnerable and brave and try. I think I
Thanks, Allison.
screen. You guys can see my screen right now, right?
Yes, we can see it. Yep.
Yeah,
That would be
so
very
Beth,
awkward.
it would be up in that corner where you clicked share right next to the leave button.
Mhm.
So when you click on that, there should be, you should be able to see like share content and then the different screens you have and then include computer sound. Yes. There we go. If you click on that,
On more?
if you click on, you might have to stop sharing and then
Yeah.
share again.
Yep.
Okay. Stop sharing. I'm gonna share again. And there was something on the screen to say
It
share.
Yeah, it should say include computer sound when you click on that share button.
Oh. Thank
And to
you.
actually correct Kelly, I am the opposite of an IT specialist.
I know.
For
I
any
just
of
had to
you,
say that.
I know for any of you that know me, so I'm shocked I even remembered that.
Thank you, everyone, for helping.
Thank
So we
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I swear I usually use Teams and I know how to use Teams or Zoom. Okay, let's try again.
Housing First has 5 key
Working.
principles. If you're not following the 5 principles, it's not Housing First. Principle number 1, immediate access to housing with no housing readiness conditions. Participants meet with the support team once per week, but housing is not dependent on psychiatric treatment, abstinence, or other readiness conditions. And when we say no housing readiness conditions, we mean none. Now, many participants stay housed in their first rental, but evictions happen. With the support team's help, it's an opportunity for learning, adjusting, and the immediate chance to try again. Research shows Housing First reduces emergency room visits, hospitalization, shelter use, detox services, and incarceration. There are no common indicators that predict who Housing First will and won't work for. So given its effectiveness, let's focus on Housing First, then let participants tell us the next step.
All of us deserve housing. Everybody on the planet deserves a decent place to live. So it's not about, are you ready? Everyone is ready. And what we find is when people move into their own place, readiness comes.
It made sense to me that really the only readiness for housing was, were we able to sign the paperwork and get the damage deposit, and could they find their way back home? Did they have the capacity to do that? That was housing readiness. And really outside of that, I struggle to understand what it is that you need in order to be housed other than that place, that the door handle to turn and to be able to walk through that threshold.
We've been somehow doing things backwards for a long time, telling people they should work on their addiction and their mental health and do all this paperwork stuff. And then after that, they'll be worthy of having somewhere to sleep.
But you can't not house people for the very reasons they need housing. That's why we say housing first, right? You have to be housed first, and from there, other things can happen.
My perception was that it was outside the realm of possibility. We can't do that. You have to go through these steps that have been laid out for all of us. So it really just reverses the whole system in this radical way. But the thing is that it works, and it works particularly well for people who are experiencing chronic homelessness.
you can't tell from the get-go who's going to succeed or who's going to fail. What you do know from the beginning is if you do it well, you will have a great success with 80% of the people.
For those of us that have ever worked in housing for a while, it's like it's a never list of waiting. So this was amazing to me. It was absolutely amazing. I mean, you just sit down and meet somebody and you say, hi, do you need somewhere to live? And it's just like this magic door opens.
The quickness that we got to go past any kind of assessment and straight to getting people in housing was kind of amazing. And I don't think I really appreciated at the time how unique it was. Going out into coffee shops and meeting people for the first time, and the first conversation we're having with them before we're talking about kind of struggles they had or kind of housing history was, where do you want to live? What kind of place you want to go to, and what's the quickest we can get you there?
I think the biggest change I observed in myself in this, working with this model, was how I needed to throw out some of my beliefs in my incredible ability to predict things, because it was incredible how difficult it was to know who was going to do okay with the project.
We have this piece of paper that says that this person can't live in their home or needs supported housing, yet this person doesn't want to live in that place. What do we do?
There's a whole bunch of people where the story that had been told about them, the mounds and folders of collateral that was coming in, and even their presentation would scream not housing ready. Or, yeah, we're going to be back, we're housing them this time, or, you know, sort of be that inkling in the back of the mind that says, well, maybe we shouldn't put them in the nicest apartment building because that's not going to last. And a lot of those people being in a stable, safe environment, a place that they could actually care about and build something in, completely changed things.
We're just going to have to give these apartments away one person at a time. We're not going to screen. 50 books drop away. We're not going to do any assessments. 100 books drop away. All this knowledge of, like, you know, how do we figure it out is no longer being applied in that way.
After like 4 or 5 years of working on this model, that I think that everybody's beliefs about who can live in independent apartments and who can't needs to be revised. I don't think any of the occupational scales that we typically use to determine housing suitabilities, any of the models we have for who should live in what kind of housing, I think they're probably all wrong.
I mean, everyone's very focused on, let's predict who can't make it. But in fact, we can't predict who can make it. You know, we really don't know. So we have to give every single person a chance to demonstrate what they can do in that new environment.
I'd meet people and just think, oh, this guy's going to get housed. Within 2 months, he's going to have a job. He's going to graduate from the team. And that would not be the way things would go at all. And then I'd meet somebody and think, this is really going to be a challenge. 2 months later, I'd be sitting in their apartment, having a latte with them, with the espresso machine they just bought. I mean, there was no way of knowing at all.
As staff, we just need to let go of the idea that we know everything and you know, realize that we don't know anything. And you know, what we're there to do, if we're running Housing First programs, is to give people a chance, right? We don't know. So we got to be there to support people no matter what, get them in there, and whatever happens, happens, and we deal with it. But, you know, we can't predict how people's lives go.
In housing in the past, if you blew it, you sort of blew it and you're out again, and you're back into that cycle. So I think that's what worked with Housing First, is that you don't blow it, you try again.
The model expects, I would say expect people to fail, but expects to have challenges along the way. And with the model, I mean, evictions are common, right? And that's part of the model, that people get evicted and then, you know, you put them in a new apartment and you look at ways to be successful. And that's what we found. We found a lot of people didn't make it in their first apartment. And I would say that, you know, we had a very, very challenging population.
We were very upfront with landlords. So it's not a housing only program, it's a Housing First program. And so we basically said, we're not going to promise problem-free tenancy, but what we are going to promise is responsiveness.
Continuing to have choice even in the face of failure. So, which is when it's most difficult to continue to give people choice. They just crashed out of their first apartment, and you have spent an enormous amount of time helping them set up in that first apartment, and there's an enormous disappointment on everybody's part. But let's not confuse what our job is to the experience of the person who actually lost the apartment. The disappointment is theirs. I mean, they have failed. We're there to support them through that failure, not to punish or judge. And how do you sustain that kind of belief that they can do better the next time?
And we found that most often people learned from their first experience, and if things didn't go well, they certainly went well in their second apartment. And the support teams are key. Once we sort of found the housing and someone chose where they wanted to live, that was the next phase where it was absolutely vital.
And so I think the difference is by putting them into apartments is you're really giving people something that they can work with and make changes with and go forward in their lives, which is different than, I think, just recurring shelterage.
At the end of the day, there's a need for shelters, emergencies, crises, unexpected stuff does happen, and you need a foot in the door, a way in where you can't, give a month's notice or sort of all of the parameters that come with renting places. But shelters are not where people need to be generally. People need to be in housing that makes sense to them.
Especially folks who have systemic barriers to why they're not housed, right, in terms of colonization, poverty, misogyny, the murder of Aboriginal women in this country and Canada. Like, all of these things stacked up against folks. You don't fix that first. You house people first.
So yeah, really, really good. Hope you liked it. Really good. There's 5 of them. Videos. So kind of that's that piece on that immediate access to housing. And I wish I had put in, so in housing navigation, that's been one of the biggest things that we've been figuring out since the very beginning when we started in 2016 was how do we keep housing people and rehousing them. And we found that about 50% of our participants were still housed in the first place that they lived in. And then I think it's, was it like 20% of them were still housed in the second place? 20% were still housed in the third place. And then after that, very, very small percentages of people that we've needed to rehouse, 4, 5, 6 times. So the majority of participants in housing navigation anyway, have maintained their housing after their first couple of housing options. Because it's kind of, go ahead.
Sorry, there's a comment in the chat.
Oh yeah.
I'm not sure, from Nicholas. Nicholas, he is the MCB coordinator for his district, and I'm not sure what district he is in. He said, let's just say I have lots of frustrations with the North Dakota rental laws and how skewed the rights are for landlords versus tenants, and frustrated as to why past issues can impact eligibility.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I try, that's me. I'm Nick. I guess I'm way up here in North Border, 5 miles from the Canadian border. I had a family that I was trying to help here a few weeks ago. And, I tried to work with the local housing authority, and, while she was nice, it was, it just seemed like there were a lot of hoops to jump through, and I just thought it could have gone a lot smoother. And then it was, oh, well, I'm not sure they would be eligible. But yeah, I was just shocked, like in other states. I came from Minnesota, and I believe that renters had quite a bit more protections there. You can't just come and say, you're out and here's your notice and now you got 3 days. Yeah, that kind of blew me away. Like 3 days is unbelievable to me, but
that's not.
Jacob, I think you're
Jacob
muted.
is muted. Yep.
Well, it's not the law, Nicholas. They'll give the 3-day notice. You don't have to leave, but most people don't know that. They have to go to court to get a eviction order to force them out. So people that leave in 3 days are just frightened and are unaware of the law. So please don't communicate that you have to get out in 3 days. That is not required.
No, and I never did. In fact, you know, it was pretty limited, the help I was able to give this family. I was able to point them in some directions at the new location that they wound up. You know, but you got to reach out to like your fair housing people in your area, in whatever city you're going to, whether it's Fargo or Grand Forks. You know, and really tried to, I'm like, hey, I'm not sure this is quite right here. Let's look in. But the wheels started moving and they moved pretty quickly. So that was their decision, which is fine. But I think that some of that scared them off when they're told by other people, you know, the landlord, building owner, whatever, hey, you got 3 days, get out.
It scares them, and people will leave all their stuff in their apartment. It happens all the time, and it is really sad because people are afraid and they think they have to go, and they do not.
Right. I'm glad to have learned that today, at least. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, no, and also I would echo you too. So Housing Navigation, we work in Cass and Clay County. So we work with Minnesota law and North Dakota law, and definitely Minnesota renters have a lot more protections than North Dakotans. But you know, Jacob is right. The 3-day notice is really just, we just call it like a like it's like a courtesy flower. They're like, could you leave? We're trying to pretend that you have to leave, but you don't. And then remember too, if they leave all their stuff there in the state of North Dakota, that landlord has to hold it for 28 days. They can charge them for storage and like getting it out. But definitely like legal aid, really good stuff from them. But thanks for bringing up that point. It's really, really hard when there's these system barriers. And as we kind of move through the PowerPoint, that's one of the last things we talk about too, is that as Housing First advocates, we're stigma busters, we're oppression like attackers. Like you have to do it all the time. I literally just this weekend was talking to a landlord was having a rough time, and the first thing they say to me is, you moved one of those bums in here. Bums never do well here. They can't live here, da 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 da. And so part of my job is shifting out of like case manager, whatnot, focus with my person and giving that landlord some education, because it's not setting up the person I'm working with for success when the landlord is having those preconceived notions around them, and just like how based in social justice our work truly, truly is. So thank you for that comment.
There are a couple other comments in the chat. I don't know if we want to kind of hold off on them. One of them is mainly directed to Nick. So I don't know if Josh, if you maybe want to connect with Nick privately and ask maybe. And then Alyssa asked a question as well. And I'm not sure if anyone knows the actual legal answer to this. I would like to say I think I know the answer to this, but I don't want to give legal advice. And it's just, if you wait past the 3 days, the landlord goes to court and gets the eviction. Can the tenant be held financially responsible for the court costs of getting this order? Does anyone know the answer?
You can refer back to the lease. A lot of the times in the leases, they'll specify that. Most leases I've seen. But yeah, Eric Wolf is on the
tenants'
call.
rights. Yay, thank
Great.
you. Thank you for sharing that.
So
Good combo.
yeah, no, thank you for that. We really shouldn't talk about Housing First without talking about tenant rights at the exact same time.
Exactly.
So consumer choice and self-determination. I have this on my board at work, and it's just kind of this constant reminder to myself that truly one of the most sincere forms of respect is actually listening to what another person has to say. I hear over and over and over again from people that we've served that they feel different when they are served by programs that really do respect them because they feel listened to. And a lot of times they're startled when we ask for like, well, how can we do better? How can the program be better? What can we do for you? Like, you're the expert in your life. What can we do for you? So I try to ground myself in that. Something that we really honed in on so like it's one thing to like sit here and talk about like the principles of housing first, like the core intervention of housing first. It's another thing to be boots on the ground, working with a caseload across multiple people, having people, you know, it's another thing to be doing the work, right? And how hard the work can be. And something that Kelsey, my lead worker, and I had come up with one night when we'd finished up our home visits, we were sitting back to our office and we were trying to really like ground ourselves because someone that we were working with, um, we were having like our own bias. It was really hard for us to hear, when we had left the apartment, even, chatted through all her options, reviewed her values, and it sounded like, she was going to make her own choice, and it sounded like the choice she was about to make was almost certainly going to get her kicked out of her place, get her an eviction. And we were both sitting there and we were like, but we've seen this, we know. But then we really had to just take a step back and like, okay, but what can happen from this action? There could be she could get evicted, but then what? What can we do from there? And it's this idea that, so like, well, we could go in, we could like pretend like we can't really do this, right? But we could like say like, no, if you let that person in, you are getting evicted. And like, no, all these things, when in actuality, it doesn't matter about our programs. It doesn't matter about us as case managers. This is always about that person's life. And I feel, having worked with people across in lots of different situations, if I can help them feel comfortable making their own choices and reclaiming their right to make their own choices, we feel like that's the currency of empowerment. And ultimately helping people end their homelessness when they've been homeless many, many years, there is figuring out like what choices can they make and helping them on that piece. So we have this written on our wall. We have lots of things written on our walls, but like meaningful choice making is the currency of empowerment. It includes, so when we're talking from a housing first perspective on consumer choice and self-determination, it's not only about like where they live, it's about what do they want their life to look like after they move in? What do they want their services to look like? And again, when we're working with landlords and housing navigation, and kind of talking, to them about the program, we echo very much what one of the presenters talked about in that video. We don't promise perfect tenants. We don't believe there are any perfect tenants, regardless if they've been homeless or not, but we do promise perfect responsiveness. So we talk to landlords, about that we're going to respond when there are issues. We do also let them know fully in the beginning that this is an entirely voluntary program. Someone could move in and decide they don't want to see us ever again. But in the history of our 7 years in our program, that's happened like maybe once. And so landlords usually feel good about that. What happens a lot when people move in is sometimes it is that piece where they're like, never mind, this is weird and awkward. Sometimes, a lot of times they're like, we don't want to live here anymore. We want to move back to the street. This is freaky. So that's where like the relationship building is so key, and honoring their self-determination, but having enough of a relationship with them too, to know like what they value beyond when they're not in crisis, and how do we like help them align themselves towards that. Harm reduction is an essential model for consumer choice. I know that Jan Eliason is going to be doing a harm reduction focused thing for you guys here. So I didn't want to go too terribly deep into it. But again, I think it's when we in Housing Navigation talk a lot about like, how are we living housing first today? How are we living and breathing harm reduction? Because it really is, it's not like an intervention that you just kind of like pull out of your backpack when you're going into a visit and open up and be like, okay, I'm doing harm reduction now. It's not like that at all. It's breathing it, it's living it. It is just honoring that person's right to make choices and helping them figure out what is the best choice for them. And we talk about like you got to give up control in that harm reduction model, but you also have to understand that you never had control in the first place, right? It's like this thing that we think that we have. But every time you make an assumption, you take a choice away. And homelessness has taken away so many of people's choices. It's truly where homelessness is this social injustice. It's this oppression, because the things that people can access are so different when they're homeless. I have more in the next slide, so I might just go. So like, why does choice matter? This just happened just the other day. So someone told me like, thanks for not placing me in some apartment. Like that's happened to them a lot in the past. Thanks for letting me look at all these different places. And he said, I really love this place. I can see airplanes taking off and landing several times a day. It's poetry. Being housed is poetry. And I like nearly fell on the floor. I was like, what? This is the most fulfilling thing that's been said to me this year. Like, you're incredible. Thank you. That's all the thanks I need. But it was really cool. And it was just, again, this reminder to me to not get clinical, to not be thinking about like mental health and substance use. And like, even though like you can't really do this work without a pretty deep understanding of those pieces. But it's just more important to think about like, what does that person value? What would make their heart sing? And it was poetry to him to be housed because he could see airplanes taking off and landing. And so recovery orientation, the third principle of housing first. I love Heather Gilmore. She was in the first video. They have a video on recovery. And I just love her definition of recovery. She defines it as being able to make decisions for herself, to live her values, and to be a valuable member of my community. And so really looking at, why is recovery so important within Housing First? It's because of this, everything that we lose, that people lose when they're homeless. Like I love that, we brought up those rights that people have in tenancy, because people do, they lose their rights. You lose so many rights when you are homeless. Like you still do technically have rights, but I always talk, one of the important things in the Housing First approach is teaching tenants about their lease, about their responsibilities and their rights. So I always make a huge deal, like I would do a cartwheel if I still could, but I kind of do a metaphorical cartwheel when we have a lease with them, when they have their lease. And I always talk to them about like, I know that this is a big, like this is a lot of paperwork. I know paperwork is sometimes like not a fun thing that we want to be thinking about, but here's the great thing. You have more rights today than you had yesterday because you signed this piece of paper, and let's talk about them. So here's what I'm seeing in your lease. You have a right to not have anybody enter this unit, right? So then explaining that from that values-based piece, because I know like back in the day when I did training, some people had been like, and then you explain their lease and you go point by point, and I'm like, no one cares. So like, we have to like explain to people why this matters and get their attention. So I always talk about signing your lease and why it's a big deal, because you have more rights today than you did yesterday. But, and people, how are they recovering, like even responsibilities? That's sometimes a big piece that comes up in Housing First in our practice is people are like, I lost my key. I don't want keys. I could lose them. And so then making a plan for how they can keep their keys. Literally, no one moves into a place that we're supporting without us doing a key plan all the way. And I think in a couple months, or I don't know when it is, but there's a training in this series on Housing First Now What? And so me and Kelsey from my housing navigation team will be kind of talking more in depth. So I should probably not go too deep into all of these, but that's one of the big pieces is how are you going to keep track of your key? And it's that sense of purpose and identity. Self-esteem, I just hear over and over and over again from people that they didn't like themselves as much when they were homeless on the street and everyone could see every possession that they owned, and that at any minute, like, police could do a sweep and all their stuff would be gone or out. Like, the lack of dignity in that process is just this theft of dignity by the suppression of homelessness. And so how can we help people reclaim that dignity, reclaim their self-esteem? And not to say that everybody who's homeless is lacking self-esteem or feeling bad about it, but just being aware that homelessness again and again is not a mental illness. So we don't use like mental illness interventions to treat homelessness. We use a holistic approach and just about being that, who is that person? I loved a gal that we worked with. We were talking kind of about, recovering from homelessness, and was there any way that she wanted to be supported around that, or was there anything, that we could learn from that she could teach us about her in that? And she had said eyeliner. She said, recovery to me is if I'm wearing eyeliner. We said, why is that? She said, well, number one, I have a place to like have a mirror so I can do my eyeliner correctly, because this lady was fancy. She had beautiful eyeliner technique, just beautiful wings or whatever you would call it. And she's like, so I need a place to keep my eyeliner. I need a mirror. She's like, and I need to have not been beaten up while I was sleeping outside under the bridge, because black eyes don't go well with eyeliner. So she just, in that humanizing moment, we made a whole case plan out of that, right? Around that eyeliner. And it wasn't about like, we're going to keep our symptoms in check from your substance use disorder and all of that. It was like, what matters to you? And how can we integrate that and show you that housing is where you can make those things happen? And that kind of leads pretty similarly in a hand-holding way into our individualized and person-driven supports, our fourth principle of Housing First. And so these principles of Housing First guide our process. They don't prescribe the process. I've had the incredible privilege of working with so many people over the last 13 years, and I have never once in all of my work ever had a case plan look the same. No one's has ever looked the same. Because everyone's journey is really unique and different. Like, everyone may have in common that they've been homeless, but that they've been oppressed by this social injustice. That's the only common factor. Everything else is deep and intrinsic to that person once they're connected to that human dignity of housing and supports. And I really like one of the approaches that we really learned from the people that we served in housing navigation and a lot of people I worked with in the shelter is this real mindfulness that people are homeless because our systems have failed them. And a lot of the times when we're coming in, I know like some people have requested assistance being like, well, these people are like angry right away. They don't want to work with us. They're not opening up, da 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 da. And usually I talk about you're probably in the prove yourself period. The prove yourself period, we feel typically lasts anywhere from 3 months to forever, right? Probably forever. But there's the system behind people that they've experienced that hasn't been empowering. And so again, to be homeless, you have had to have so many systems fail you, so many supports fail you. And so when we're coming into that relationship, being really open and honest about that, and knowing that this is when we prove ourselves, we need to do what we say we're going to do when we're going to do it and earn people's respect. It's not given, it's earned, right? And so this understanding that previous systems have failed people and they're going to be suspicious of you and suspicious of Housing First. And that's okay. That's a survival mechanism. That's how they're not dead on the street. And we celebrate that. And then we figure out how can we kind of transform that into stable housing and use those skills. And just really walking alongside people that there's all these systemic issues that they've faced in their life, and homelessness was not their fault. which I don't like this line, even though it's in my PowerPoint, minimize control and coercion as much as possible. Well, I guess it's like minimize control and destroy coercion as much as possible. Because we really don't want to be coercive. You never want to use, like when you're working with someone in housing, if you do this, you're going to lose your housing. I mean, but is that a conversation? 100,000%, absolutely. So if you're working, so, when we've worked with somebody who say they are using drugs or even say that they're selling drugs. So talking about with them using a harm reduction approach, okay, this is a choice that you're making. What are the ways that you can minimize how that's going to impact your housing? Instead of being coercive and being like, well, we won't work with you if you're doing drugs, or like, we won't, like, you're going to get kicked out. Walking through with people. Okay, so if there's a lot of people coming to your apartment like 30 times a day to have interactions, what could happen? Neighbors could see, neighbors could make complaints, could be da 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 da. So just like working through that with people. That's just like, I guess, a random example, but we want to maximize their control of their situation. So it's not us making a rule like you can't have this happening. And really giving people the opportunity to find their own recovery path. So I have this sewing machine over here. I wish I had taken a picture of the actual sewing machine that I was crushed under when I was trying to carry it up to someone's apartment. So it was like, yeah, many, many years ago. And oh man, I met her. I'd known her for a few years here and there, but was working with her in housing navigation. And she took one look at me and was like, what? I was like, hey, I'm here. I want to see if I can help you. Would you be interested in blah, blah, blah? So she was interested, got her moved into her place. Immediately, she was just like, no. It's like, what's no? And she's like, I don't want to work with anybody. I said, okay, you don't have to, but could you tell me why? And she ended up being like, I am not making an effing case plan. I'm like, good. We don't have to make a case plan. Is there anything else you don't want to do? So we started our relationship when she moved into housing I got this ginormous sticky note, like the ones that go on the wall, the big one. And we made a list of everything we were not doing. And I was not talking to her. I was not talking to her about her alcohol use. I could talk to her if she brought it up first, but I was not to bring that up first. I wasn't to tell her. It was just like a really good list. And it was just basically a list of here's all the trauma that I've experienced and all of these things. Don't mess with me. I was like, love it. Strong boundaries. And I was like, well, what can I help you do? And she was like, no case plan. I'm like, correct. But what could I help? How can I help? She's like, well, I want a sewing machine. I said, okay. And so we ended up so then we made we called it, what did we call it? Our kick-ass plan. we did not make a case plan, but we did make a kick-ass stay housed plan. And it all was around the sewing machine. So we had to find it. And then she, of course, found a sewing machine that had feet. This is literally the sewing machine I'm talking about. It wasn't a quick thing. It was she's like, take me here. We'll get the sewing machine. And then I'm carrying it up the stairs because she's very unable to do that. It was very large. But then almost immediately through the week by week would pass and her housing kept getting more stable. Her drinking had reduced significantly. Her health was better. And it was really all centered around this sewing machine. She quit drinking. She reduced the amount she was drinking because she couldn't sew when she was that plastered. She started taking her medication for her liver failure because when she was taking them inconsistently, was having all of these issues with that sewing machine. And eventually it was about reconnecting with her children, her grown children, her family, because she had used the sewing machine to make them quilts. And I had this incredible privilege of watching this person that, on paper did not seem like we weren't really, there was a competency eval there. We weren't really sure that they could make their own decisions to be housed. she was successfully housed for the rest of her life. And I think it all started with the sewing machine. It was a recovery piece. It was recovering that identity that she lost, because she certainly could not have this sewing machine with her when she was living outside. The last piece of the Housing First principles is this concept of community integration. And so I like the definition of it as this opportunity to live in the community and be valued for your uniqueness and abilities, basically just like everybody else. And really looking at, again, so we're helping people integrate into the community so that they don't have to so that they can go back to the shelter if they want to for support, but they have other places to go. I know somebody, used to love to, I don't know, actually love is a strong word, but he had his routine. And even when we moved him into housing, he kept going back to the shelter all the time because he was like, well, I can help. I like to organize the donations. And eventually what if you got a job at a thrift store and got paid to organize someone else's donations? And he was like, absolutely not. And then a few weeks later, he was like, what was that thing you were talking about? Okay. And we did. He got hired in a thrift store. I think he started as a volunteer, and then because of systemic barriers, because he had all this criminal background, but then he volunteered. They trusted him. They hired him, and he worked there for, I think he probably still works there. And it was really cool to see, because he was so lonely and isolated in his place, and he made a couple other friends at this place he was working, and they showed him this senior center where you could go and play pool, things I didn't even know about as his case manager. And then he joined that senior organization, and then he was doing stuff with them, just really integrated into the community. That homelessness was part of his history, but it wasn't his whole story. I think around with the community integration piece too, that we don't end homelessness as agencies or even as a coordinated entry system. We end homelessness as a community. I remember how devastating it was when I was working in shelter and we'd get calls from the news and being like, so this person died on the street last night. Where was your shelter? What were you doing? And while it's always important for shelters to look at what did happen and what we were doing, I just wanted to answer back homelessness is not a shelter issue. It's actually a community issue. These aren't just these special people that nobody else should work with. These are our neighbors. This is the same person that you go to the grocery store with. These are not separate people. They're our neighbors. Everybody should be horrified and taking responsibility when someone dies on the street, not just this agency that gets minimal funding to work with them. So that's my piece. And so just it's finding a sense of belonging in the community, but then also this piece on helping communities become a safe space where people can belong, because there's just so much stigma, there's so much prejudice across the community. And so we want to add into our job description, we were brainstorming it the other day, we're mythbusters, anti-stigma activists, community builders, education extraordinaire, even when you don't want to educate anyone anymore because you're tired. But there's always more people to educate, and it makes a difference. There's been some really incredible progress made in downtown Fargo with the businesses. I think I have slides on this coming, so right, I just check. No, but where they've gotten so much education, and so often they're like, no, we understand the solution to homelessness is housing, and we understand that people are suffering, but our businesses are also we can't have people doing stuff in front of them. And, and so through a lot of education that was done, Jan Eliason, the Gladys Ray Shelter, did such incredible education. The businesses, seriously, you go to these meetings and the businesses talk the language, they get it. So many of them, the majority of them get it. They're just, still dealing with some issues, right? So I think it really can make a difference. So we're helping people integrate into the community, but we're also advocating on the community level for the community to be welcoming and a good place for people to be, everybody. So Housing First it's transformative, it's research-based, it saves money, it's amazing, and it's all about relationships. But what is it not? So Housing First is super not housing only. I was at the Pathways to Housing conference, or no. That is not the actual term of it. Katie Jo was there too, and I think that she is on this call. And Katie Jo is amazing and also runs a Housing First program. And so, Katie Jo, you are here.
Partners Conference.
Thank you. Katie Jo and I were at the Housing First Partners Conference. And so Katie Jo is here, super duper amazing expert. So we can ask her questions too. Feel free to chip in, Katie, especially with things like what conference we were at. But I was at this breakout session and these people were like, did this whole presentation on how Housing First was pretty helpful for their community, but like they had to get Medicaid so they could give these support services to people once they moved in, because they found that they moved people in and they kept losing their housing. And I was like, well, you weren't doing Housing First in the first place. Why are you presenting? Who vetted them? But so like this just gets forgotten all the time and it doesn't seem like it should, but it does. So I wanted to really talk about it. So Housing First is not housing only. Ian DeYoung from OrgCode, we did a lot of technical assistance with them when we started Housing Navigation. And I remember him talking about like keeping people housed or finding people housing is relatively easy. And I was like, pardon? I worked in a shelter while I was housing homeless people who are homeless who had sex offenses on their record. You think that was easy, relatively? And then he says, keeping people housed is relatively hard. I was like, what? It's true. I worked in shelter for 6 years and now supportive housing in 7. Finding the housing is relatively easy, even though it's really, really hard. But keeping people housed is harder. So we have like our sprint of finding housing and our marathon of keeping people housing. So when people move into housing, it's like, peace, y'all, I'm out. No. This is when the party gets started. That's kind of what we say, like the party don't start till they walk into their housing. And that's when the work really starts. And again, we have our housing, You've Got Housing Now What is really, that presentation is really dedicated to all the tools and stuff that we use with people when they're housed to help support them. So Housing First is also not anything goes. I've provided some technical assistance to other agencies in our community and others that really struggle with this concept around like, well, and they're like, we're trying to be housing first. But people's behavior is out of control. They're like, someone was making meth in their apartment and all these things. And it's like, oh, that's not okay. And it wouldn't be a Housing First approach to say that's okay. Because, it kind of depends on the program. But for example, the Pathways Housing First, they have 2 requirements for people when they come in. The participants need to agree to follow a standard lease, and they need to agree to weekly home visits. This is pretty similar to what we do in Housing Navigation as well. And so if Housing First is anything goes, then we're not helping people learn. And so we don't want to shield them from like natural consequences of behaviors, like the person dealing drugs that we talked about earlier. There could be a very natural consequence to that behavior of them getting evicted. And so it's our job to, first of all, not judge them for that behavior, because judgment's going to get us nowhere. It's to leverage and use our relationship with them to help them understand how that could impact their housing, and then ways we can use harm reduction to have that not impact their housing. Maybe if you're going to sell drugs, sell it super far away from your apartment. I mean, like super far away from your apartment. Something that we talk about a lot. Yeah. And again, I think it's why relationships are so darn important, because a lot of times you're having really hard conversations with people about pieces, conversations with people about having their they're a mom, their adult child is, or not a child, but their adult son or daughter are staying with them and causing huge impacts to their housing, not just because they're there, but because of all the things that they're doing. And really being able to have that relationship in place so that you can have those hard conversations, because that's deep pain right there. A mom that I worked with who said that, she just felt like even though having her son there was likely going to get her an eviction because of all the things he was doing, she just felt such shame for that she couldn't be a mom to him before, when she was homeless for 20 years. And now she had housing and she just wanted to have that. And so being able to have that relationship there so that she knew that I wasn't judging her, and me just continuing to try to listening to understand, not listening to get her to do something, but still holding space for that fact that she's having real shame and real pain. And there are consequences to some of the decisions she's making that are going against her value of staying housed. And so how we have those conversations. It was said, well, this is literally Kelsey's note from a home visit a couple weeks ago, where we were just, again, that kind of trying to constantly be soliciting feedback from our participants. And one of our participants said, to interact with your clients as often as you can. She said she has a whole team of supports. She was talking about when she was homeless, but the only time they would come and see her was when she was in jail. She just said getting to know your participants is the only way to earn their respect, and the more you will hear the truth. They also were working on getting a landline for her apartment, I think. So just the wisdom that we get from the people we have the privilege of serving is incredible. So yeah, I wanted to take a quick minute. We've been talking, so we at Presentation Partners in Housing have our housing navigation program. I just wanted to share, so we were founded from 2015. The United Way of Cass Clay had launched this income stability initiative. I was working at the shelter at the time, and a ton of us applied for funding. Some of the agencies were saying, they couldn't get people into housing. Some were saying, like mine, were saying we can house people, but we can't keep them housed. And so the United Way was like, how can we make this person-centered instead of agency-centered? So we all got together, tons of different people. There were like 10 of us, I think, with different areas of expertise within the homeless service sector, and made this housing navigation program design. So there were 3 of us to start, and we really wanted to have this pilot to see what can we do if we can really stay true to a housing first model, because there are a lot of amazing programs in the Fargo-Moorhead area, that we're doing housing first. But how could we have one agency that can serve everybody and utilize housing first, harm reduction, just really be deeply evidence-based. So then the United Way and Presentation Partners in Housing formed this partnership to launch the program. And here's our housing navigation team. So this was my brilliant idea at the end of the day that everyone supported, or at least told me they supported. This is Linda. She works in our program. She is holding our Housing First book from Samson Barris that we use all the time. Here's Claire from our program, holding our book on ending homelessness from Ian DeYoung. Feather works with us, our manual on indigenizing housing first from Betty Adine, and the End Winnipeg. Oh, they're incredible, incredible stuff in that. Kelsey, our lead worker, with our harm reduction binder. David with our SPDAT book. And me with our incredible participants that we've served, who are the ultimate, experts in how to run our program. And we also have a landlord engagement specialist who does not work in our office because we want to have a separation of the housing and the supports, right? And I could not get him to take a picture for this PowerPoint. But so we have our collaboration, evidence-based practice, and data to effectively serve the hardest to house folks. And here's kind of that looked like. So again, we took all of these principles to see what could happen. What could we do? Here's a quick on the people that we're serving, it was just over and over again hearing that these people haven't been successful in housing. They can't be successful in housing. They are too homeless. They are too disabled. They are too blah, blah, blah. So through collaboration, through CARES, we collaborate with Fargo Housing and Clay County Housing primarily, as they provide the housing, like the voucher support, so that we can subsidize the housing. We provide the supports. We also work at our Downtown Engagement Center, where we have this incredible collaboration between Homeless Health, Fargo Public Health, and Native Inc. And have our Housing First. So we were able to house all these people and keep them housed, but like, does that actually save the community money? That's what we wanted to find out. So we do this like crazy in-depth study each year where we get, we go back 5 years with the person's signed consent, and we get 5 years of data from the emergency rooms, detox, shelter, ambulance. Can't remember if I'm forgetting anything else, but it's over there, and the jails. And we get an average of how many times they went to jail before they moved into housing, and then how many times they went to jail after. So we've been doing this every year with our incredible partner agencies who work with us to give us this data, because it's a lot of data to crunch. And here's what we found out. So for an average of people who are housed for a year versus homeless for a year, their ambulance rides decreased by 75%. Their ER visits decreased by 77%. Jail stays decreased by 82%. Detox stays decreased by a whopping, a big 95%. And shelter usage decreased almost 100%. And so we were able to show that simply by housing and supporting the chronically homeless individuals we serve, just last year, we were able to save our community nearly $500,000 in those emergency service usages alone. And then we look at the last 6 years that we've been collecting this data. We've been able to save our community over $2.5 million. And our housing retention rates with Housing Navigation, we have for last year, and it's pretty consistent year to year, 95% housed at 6 months and 88% housed at 12 months. So I just include that. So showing like we're having that fidelity to the Housing First model and able to get similar retention rates that Housing First programs get. And so just in close to the PowerPoint, just want to say like, thank you to our most important teachers and wisdom sharers. They're the people that we've had the privilege of serving in Housing Navigation. And again, hopefully this PowerPoint didn't feel too much about Housing Navigation. I really wanted it to be Housing First, but I also wanted to share the cool work we're doing, and that I promise I'm not presenting on these principles just because like I went to a training and know about them. Like we're living and breathing this, and would love to talk more, like connect with everybody else who's doing it, hear what's going well for you, see if we can help each other. Really, really great stuff. So thank you for being here. Here's my contact information. Ending half an hour or done half an hour early, but so I think that there's plenty of time for questions and chatting if people want to. But thank you for your
If
time.
anyone has any questions or comments, now's the time. Speak now. Just kidding. Or not. If you don't, feel free to log off. We can kind of sit around for a few minutes, Beth, if that's okay with you, in case someone has something. Okay. We can sit and stare at each other. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
I have a question.
Sure.
So what is a good strategy to help somebody increase their credit score so they're more eligible for apartments?
I mean, I know that you can work with like credit. There's like different, like here in Fargo, I don't know where you are. The Village has credit counseling, but I know that they talk about, paying off some of the debts.
Yeah, because I feel like that has been a barrier in getting somebody housed quickly. Like eventually they will get housed, but yeah, with a low credit score, like even Goldmark won't take them, even through Goldmark Thrive. So I was just wondering if there's some quick way to fix a credit score. But yeah, I like the idea of the village.
Yeah, I think the piece is that's where we try to like engage landlords, right? Because I don't think anybody I work with has a good credit score. I mean, some people do, but just around that education piece um, with landlords.
Gotcha. Thank you for answering my question.
Yeah.
Just a lot of thank yous in the chat. Good content. So there's that.
Thank you. I believe you're going to send out a survey, right, Kelly, at the
Yes.
end? It would be really
Yes.
helpful if people fill that out. Deeply appreciate feedback on how to.
Yes, and I did not get a link for the survey.
I can get that to you, Kelly.
Okay, thank you. I was like,
Beth, do you just want it in the chat or do you want us to send it out in an email?
Oh, I don't know. Whatever you want.
maybe an email might be better. I don't
Email.
know.
Okay, sounds good. We can do that.
That way I can send it out. Awesome. Okay. Does anyone else have any questions?
If not, thank you guys so much for your
Yeah,
time.
thank you
Thanks for
guys.
being here today.
Yes, thank you guys.